Sousse is not just one of the oldest cities in Tunisia, it's also older than many European major capital cities including London, Paris and Berlin. And because of that, this city is incredibly rich in history and culture, and that was actually one of the main reasons that drew us to this part of the country. On one side, you have these beautiful beaches, busy cafes and restaurants lining the Mediterranean coast, but then only minutes away you can actually walk through places that are actually shaped by thousands of years of history, where different civilizations, religions and empires all left their mark on this incredible city. And it was through exploring places like this that I actually wanted to take a deeper look into how Sousse actually came to be. How different people, cultures, religions actually helped shape the city that millions of people visit today. But to actually understand why the city became what it is today, you actually have to go back to nearly 3,000 years, long before it was actually called Sousse and long before Tunisia even existed, as this place was known as Hadrumetum. Now, this actually happened around about the 11th century BCE when Phoenician traders from the eastern Mediterranean began establishing small settlements across the North African coastline. As at this particular time, this region wasn't, a country in the modern sense. It was actually home to indigenous Berber communities who are actually living across North Africa. So when the Phoenicians arrived, they weren't, coming to conquer a country in the modern sense, but they were traders looking for strategic coastline locations where ships could safely stop, exchange goods and actually connect trade routes across the Mediterranean. And this coastline was pretty much almost perfect for that. The waters here are relatively calm, the land inland was fertile, and the location connected North Africa to Sicily, Italy, Spain, and the eastern Mediterranean. So what likely began at this time was, just like a small settlement, only for a few, hundred people, but slowly grew to an important trading port. Where more ships began to come in at once, the settlement began to become more reliable and more profitable. But with that, they also developed local trade with inland Berber communities as well. And these traded goods that they actually used were mainly metals, pottery, textiles, olive products, grain and salted fish. And because the settlement sat directly on the Mediterranean trade routes, wealth began to grow surprisingly quickly. Then between roughly the 9th and the 6th centuries BCE, another Phoenician settlement further north rose to dominance, and this was called Carthage. Now, this expanded into one of the Mediterranean's most powerful trading civilizations, as the city controlled huge parts of North Africa, the major sea trade routes, and even territories across Spain and nearby islands. So Hadrumetum became part of this particular world. But by the 3rd century BCE, the city found itself caught between two rising superpowers, as over the years another major power was grown as well. This was Rome, and they also wanted control over the Mediterranean trade, territory and influence. So because of this, Carthage and Rome's rivalry exploded into a series of conflicts called the Punic Wars, with one of the most famous of the battles happening during the Second Punic War, when the famous Carthaginian general Hannibal launched one of history's most legendary military campaigns by actually crossing the Alps with war elephants to invade Italy. But despite Hannibal's victories, Rome eventually gained the upper hand due to having greater long-term resources with more soldiers and allies. So the Roman forces pushed into North Africa, and cities like Hadrumetum faced a choice: remain loyal to Carthage or to survive. And with that, the city decided to align itself with Rome, and that decision transformed it completely, because after Rome destroyed Carthage in 146 BCE, North Africa became one of the empire's most valuable regions, as the land across Tunisia was incredibly fertile, producing huge quantities of wheat and olive oil for the Roman world. So Hadrumetum became an important port, helping move that wealth across the Mediterranean. Now, the Romans also built roads that connected the city to more inland agricultural regions, so the trade could actually expand. And with that, the harbour grew busier, and over time the city became heavily Romanized, as they went about building, the Roman baths, villas, public buildings and even markets. Then with that, Latin spread and the Roman customs became part of everyday life. And for centuries, this coastline in North Africa became deeply connected to the Roman world. But by the 3rd to the 4th century CE, Christianity began to spread here surprisingly early. And over time, the religion grew rapidly, and Christian communities were established across the region due to Emperor Constantine legalizing Christianity, and it becoming dominant across the empire, including here in Hadrumetum. And with that, the city actually thrived for generations as part of the Roman Mediterranean world. But then by the 5th century CE, with political instability, economic decline and invasions, the empire was reshaping and started to decline. And with that there were civil wars and groups started to take advantage as the empire really struggled more and more to defend its enormous borders. This in turn gave rise to a group called the Vandals, who crossed into North Africa and captured Carthage in 439 CE. Hadrian then came under their particular control as the Western Roman Empire's authority completely collapsed. But during this time, the Romans didn't, completely disappear overnight, with many local people still living Romanized lives, with Latin still being spoken in places, along with Christian communities continuing to exist. But over the years, the city did gradually decline from its peak of the Roman prosperity. Then later in the 6th century, the Byzantines, who were actually the eastern half of the Roman Empire, now they reclaimed the region and attempted to restore stability, but North Africa was no longer the wealthy Roman heartland it had once been before, as the trade had weakened, political instability had increased, and the Mediterranean world was ever changing. Then in the 7th century, another major transformation began as the Arab Muslim armies expanded across North Africa and took control of the region. And over time, the city itself changed identity, as under Roman and Byzantine rule, the city had been heavily Christian and culturally connected to the Mediterranean Roman world. Now gradually, it became part of the Islamic civilization stretching from North Africa to the Middle East. Now, this didn't happen straight away, but over generations, the language did become Arabic and Islam spread across the population. And with that, the identity of the city slowly changed, and what was known as Hadrumetum gradually became what we know today as Sousse. Now, the architecture of the city began to change too. Instead of these wide Roman-style public spaces, the city developed into a more defensive Islamic Medina, with these narrow streets, courtyards and markets and mosques. And when you visit Sousse today and you walk through these Medina streets, you can see how effective this actual design is. As when I took the time to walk around there, I was always looking pretty much at my phone sat-nav to actually see where I was going, and just to make sure that I was actually heading in the right direction, as you can pretty much easily get lost in there for a little while. So this was very effective and actually helped with the fact that Sousse is sat on an exposed coastline, so defense at this time became increasingly important. Then in the 9th century, under this particular dynasty, Sousse became one of the major coastal cities of the Islamic North Africa, as whoever controlled the city controlled an important section of the central Mediterranean, as the city sat along a major maritime routes linking North Africa to Sicily, southern Italy, Egypt and the wider Islamic world. So the city was strengthened with walls, watchtowers and fortifications facing the Mediterranean, and through this period gave Sousse some of its most famous historic landmarks, with the most important being the Ribat. Now this is a part fortress, part religious retreat, and it actually helped defend the city from attacks arriving actually by sea, while also serving as a place of worship and military observation, as at this time the Mediterranean was filled with conflict between rival powers, piracy and naval raids. So Sousse became a city built around both trade and survival. Then over the following centuries, control over North Africa shifted between empires and dynasties, but by the 1500s, Tunisia came under the Ottoman influence, as the Ottoman Empire expanded across much of the Mediterranean. But at the same time, Spain had emerged as a major naval power and was attempting to control the Mediterranean trade routes, so the Ottoman-backed fleets and the local Muslim rulers fought to maintain control over the region. But once Ottoman influence became established, cities like Sousse became part of a much larger imperial network stretching from North Africa to the Middle East and to southern Eastern Europe. But by the 19th century, European colonial powers were becoming increasingly dominant, with France first taking neighbouring Algeria, and then in 1881, after decades of the French influence in the region, and Tunisia itself falling heavily into debt to European powers, France used border tensions and political instability as justifications to invade in 1881, and in that same year, the Treaty of Bardo established Tunisia basically as a French state. And once again, Sousse began to change. As for centuries, most of life in Sousse had remained, concentrated inside the old fortified Medinas. But during the colonial period, the city began to spread outward, into newer districts built in very different architectural styles, with railroads and roads connecting the city more closely to the rest of the country. You have many French and European businesses being set up and often benefit disproportionately from economic development. Many Tunisians actually face political marginalization and limited control over their own country. So while Sousse modernized in many ways under the French rule, it also became part of a colonial system built around foreign control. Then came World War II, and because of Tunisia's strategic location in the Mediterranean, the country suddenly became strategically important once again, just as it had been many times throughout history. As after Germany occupied France in 1940, Tunisia came under the control of the Vichy French government, which actually collaborated with Nazi Germany. And in late 1942, fighting spread across the country during the North African campaign, with Sousse becoming a coastal city, with transport links, roads and infrastructure useful to actual military operations. It became very vulnerable to air raids and military activity. Bombing damaged parts of the city, including infrastructure around the port and nearby transport networks. But compared to some major European cities, Sousse was not completely destroyed, as by 1943 Allied forces defeated Axis troops in Tunisia, marking the end of the North African campaign. But although the city survived, the war left damage and instability behind as the French colonial rule actually continued. But in Tunisia as a whole, nationalist movements were becoming stronger, as by this time many Tunisians had fought, worked or actually lived through 2 world wars under this colonial control, and demands for independence were growing louder. Now, one of the leading figures for independence was this gentleman, who became the central face for Tunisian nationalism during the mid-20th century. Then through political pressure, negotiation, protests and increasing international support, after World War II, France gradually lost its grip on Tunisia, and in 1956 Tunisia officially gained independence. But independence also raised a major question: what would the future of cities like Sousse look like? And this answer then became tourism. So in the 1960s, 70s, Tunisia invested heavily in turning the Mediterranean coastline into an international tourist destination. As Sousse was perfectly positioned for it, as it had, the warm Mediterranean beaches, historic cities, ancient ruins, warm weather, and its location was actually in close proximity to Europe itself. So with that, hotels began rising along the coast, beach resorts expanded along with restaurants, cafes and tourist infrastructure developed rapidly. Now with all this, the waterfront had transformed completely, and developments like this particular port, which was constructed in the late 1970s, actually helped turn Sousse from an old fortified coastal city into one of Tunisia's biggest tourism centres. But despite all the modern growth, the older city like the Medina and the Ribat still looked over the sea, actually still survived. And then in 1988, the Medina of Sousse became a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which meant that while the modern city expanded with, hotels and resorts, its ancient core was now internationally protected as part of world history. Today, though, Sousse is both, a modern city where you have, your modern day shopping centres, but also a place layered with thousands of years of history. And this is one of the best known cities in Tunisia. But sadly, modern history has not always been peaceful. As in 2015, the city actually suffered one of the deadliest terrorist attacks when a gunman targeted tourists on a beach near the Imperial Marhaba Hotel in Sousse, killing 38 people, with many of them being foreign tourists, including a large number from the United Kingdom. Now, this attack shocked Tunisia and gained international attention. And for a city that depended so heavily on tourism, the impact was immediate and visitors to this great city dropped sharply. Hotels began to struggle, which I will say you can still see even today in 2026. As when we went there are large hotels along the coast that have hundreds of rooms, pools and so forth, just left abandoned and going to ruin. Then this led to businesses which actually relied on these tourists coming to suffer financially, but also beyond the economic damage, there's also a deep emotional impact on the city itself. As Sousse has spent, decades building an identity around openness, hospitality and international tourism, but pretty much overnight fear had replaced that image. But over the following years, tourism has slowly begun recovering, and though it's not quite at the height of what it once was, this city is recovering well. And in many ways, that's the resilience that reflects the entire history of Sousse itself. Because for nearly 3,000 years, like, this city has constantly adapted to change, you know, from the Phoenician traders to Roman rule, Islamic dynasties, Ottoman influence, French colonialism, and now modern day tourism. And with every era leaving something behind. And I think that's kind of like what makes Sousse so fascinating, because when you go there, it's not just another tourist destination with, you know, your nice beaches and places to relax by the pool. This city has been through it all, and yet it basically still stands today, filled with some truly amazing people who call it home. Because whilst we were there, we got to see and learn so much, from exploring the Medina to visiting the museums, but also learning actually from the locals themselves. Like, we met this gentleman at the Grand Mosque who actually took the time to explain how things work within the mosque, you know, from the call of prayer 5 times a day to why women actually have their own prayer room. And it's like listening to, you know, people's stories, you know, understanding their passion, you know, seeing how proud they are of their culture and the city that they actually live in, that really stays with you. And I will say, it was a true privilege to be able to walk these streets and just see how, you know, people live their lives, and, you know, and just learn from other cultures and beliefs.